My name is Antonio, and I do read quite a bit. Not as much lately, but back in my day, back in my prime, I definitely read a lot. And I'm trying to get back into the habit. Things have been pretty hectic on my end for the past couple years, so I don't often read for pleasure as much as I used to. Alas, this is what growing up is like. I have less free time, I have less time to do the things I enjoy. Instead, I have to do the things I need to survive. Woo, we all love living under capitalism. However, the thing that I'm going to talk about today is the duology of Crier's War by Nina. I'm not quite sure how to say her last name. Nina Varela? Varela? You know, there's all sorts of ways. I would love to have Nina on this little get together herself so that I could ask her how to say her name, and I could ask her all sorts of other questions that I have. But today we're going to be speaking about Crier's War. I had a reading slump for a little bit, for a couple months, maybe closer to a year. But the last books that I read that are number one in my line of thinking is the Burning Kingdoms trilogy, the Jasmine Throne, the Oleander Sword, and the new novel coming out in November of 2024, I believe, by Tasha Suri. That number one for me blew me away, out of the water, socks clean off. Crier's War is actually close second. Before I had read either of these series, I will have to admit, this might be embarrassing to some people, but lucky for me, I don't feel embarrassment. My favorite series prior to reading these was The Red Queen by Victoria Aveyard. So much so that my own book was kind of partly inspired, not inspired by it, but like it inspired me to write. I didn't take anything from it. I didn't incorporate any of the elements of Red Queen into the Kimura Chronicles, which is the series that I'm writing, but it did definitely encourage me to write in general. I really like it. I know a lot of people don't, but we're not here to talk about that. We can talk about that some other time if people would like to hear my opinions on it. We are here to talk about Crier's War, and as much as I keep saying that, let me actually do it. Crier's War. The description for the first book reads as such on Goodreads. Impossible love between two girls, one human, one maid, a love that could birth a revolution. After the War of Kinds ravaged the kingdom of Rabu, the Otome, designed to be the playthings of royals, took over the estates of their owners and bent the human race to their will. Now Ayla, a human servant rising the ranks at the house of the sovereign, dreams of avenging the death of her family by killing the sovereign's daughter, Lady Crier. Crier, who was made to be beautiful, to be flawless, and to take over the work of her father. Crier had been preparing to do just that, to inherit her father's rule over the land. But that was before she was betrothed to the Skyer Kinnock, who seems to have 1,000 secrets. That was before she discovered her father isn't as benevolent as she thought. That was before she met Ayla. Set in a richly imagined fantasy world, Nina Varela's debut novel is a sweepingly romantic tale of loss and love and revenge that challenges what it really means to be human. And the thing is, if I had read that description prior to actually reading the book, it would have changed. I would have gone into it knowing what to expect. But I think I kind of liked that I didn't know what I was getting into, really. I read it because I knew it was fantasy, I knew it was sapphic, and a lot of my friends, primarily my friend Nate, shout out to Nate, recommended this book to me quite a bit. Quite vehemently, I will add. And honestly, I'm not the type that usually judges a book by its cover, but I will admit the cover of the Crier's War book made me think it was going to be more sci-fi. It made me think it was going to be... There is a book that the gays really do love that I just cannot stand, and I was going to compare it to that. I'm not gonna isolate listeners this early on. You guys will learn to love me and then hate me for my opinions on certain popular books, but I'm trying to lean into the loving me part first. So, yeah, I don't usually judge a book by its cover. I try not to, but I don't like reading sci-fi too much just because of the way most sci-fi authors write their sci-fi. So I did own a copy of Crier's War since I think 2021. I had a copy and I brought it with me throughout my moves, and I finally sat down to read it about a week ago. And halfway through Crier's War, I decided to buy the second book, Ironheart. So if you guys couldn't fathom what I thought of this book, maybe the fact that I bought the second book before completely finishing the first one will give you some indication, aside from the fact that I'm actually making a little podcast, whatever this is, about it. Crier's War definitely changed me as a person. Like I said, it skyrocketed, honestly, to the top of my list. It's probably my second favorite series now, but not for the reasons that I expected it to be my favorite. I primarily read fantasy. That is the genre that appeals to me the most. Always has. Even back when I was younger, I would read anything, but I was drawn towards fantasy. I write fantasy. Fantasy is my lifeblood. So going into this, all I knew that it was fantasy and that it was sapphic. And usually those are my criteria for reading. Something has to be fantasy and something has to be sapphic, which no wonder I haven't been reading a lot lately if those are the things that I want to read about. Those were the things that I knew about it. I don't think I knew anything else, but I remember, just hearing my friends talk about it and laud it so much, praise it so highly. And then I came across some fan art of it on TikTok. And then I was like, oh, they're brown. Okay, that adds to the appeal for me personally, because a secret third thing that I enjoy, it has to be fantasy, it has to be sapphic, and I would prefer it if the main characters were BIPOC. And if that was a requirement for everything that I read, I would not get a lot of reading done, just to show you the absolute lack of representation in fantasy and in fiction and in writing as a whole. But Crier's War really hit the whole trifecta with me. Fantasy, sapphic, and the main characters would be considered BIPOC in our world. And as a bonus, the author is also BIPOC, as far as I can tell. So I'm gonna start this off by saying I would probably give Crier's War as a whole a 4.5 out of 5 stars. I think the first book was written incredibly well, just well done, to the point where you could see the rise and fall, even though you didn't really expect certain things, or some of you who might pride yourselves on figuring out plot points before they occur, you might have seen things coming. I prefer to read with an open mind. When I go to the movies, when I read, I turn off my brain. I'm here to experience the plot in the way that the author intended for us. I'm not thinking ahead. I'm not wondering what's going on. I'm sitting my ass down and reading the entire book in one sitting. So, as I read Crier's War, I didn't realize also that it was an enemies to lovers thing until a couple chapters in. Crier had some errant thoughts here and there. No, Ayla had some errant thoughts here and there regarding Crier, and I'm trying to be spoiler free as much as I can for this portion of the review. Ayla had some errant thoughts about Crier, and it took a second, longer than it probably should have, for me to realize that this was going to be an enemies to lovers type of situation. And honest to goodness, I don't typically read enemies to lovers unless it's like fan fiction, or unless I'm like watching a cartoon or whatever. Enemies to lovers is not normally how things go, especially not authentic enemies to lovers, which some might argue. I could see the case being made that this isn't authentic, that they were never truly enemies, or even if they were, that the animosity between two was primarily one-sided. I just really love how well written it was. It was very evocative. Primarily the second book, which is called Ironheart. The second book, I just got done reading it probably a half hour ago because I took a break to play Fortnite a little bit just to reboot my systems to put the masculinity back inside of me, because I did halfway through start crying, and then I kept crying for an hour. I think it took me about 4 hours to read Ironheart, and for the majority of it, I admit that I was crying, and it was just a lot of emotion, and I'm not really used to books making me feel so deeply. For me, when I read books, most of the time, I can separate myself from the characters. I can be like, this is happening in their world, their world that doesn't exist in mine. I'm not a part of their world. I'm not in their universe. I'm not experiencing these things. But the thing about Ironheart and the Crier's War duology is that it just feels so realistic. It feels like if these events were to come to pass in our world, in our timeline, this could be how things played out. It feels not too far away, not too detached from our own current present reality. And I think on top of that, on top of the plausibility of this happening in a world where something like this could occur, the characters also felt so relatable. The main characters, Ayla and Crier, are the focus point of this series. I think another thing is that I went into this expecting it to be like all of the other typical fantasies that I've read, where it's very plot driven. But I would honestly make the case, and I don't know if the case needs to be made, this may be the whole intention. I would make the case that Ayla and Crier's romance is the thing that drives the plot in this duology, which is not something I'm used to reading. I'm not used to reading something where romance is not the priority, but it's like the hardest hitting thing in a series. I'm not used to reading like that. I tend to shy away from books that are more romance driven. And honestly, if somebody had told me that this was romance driven, I probably would have stayed away from it, and I would have missed out on something amazing. The thing about Ayla and Crier is that they are so relatable. As you can tell by the description that I read, Ayla is oppressed. Honestly, all the humans are oppressed in Crier's War, and Ayla wants to change things. She wants to be a part of the revolution. She wants to get revenge for her family that was murdered by Crier's father, quote unquote. The thing about this is that Crier and the Atame, the not particularly human characters in this book, is that they were made with a capital M. They weren't born, they were designed with a capital D. In my interpretation, alchemists discovered what it takes to create life. They found out what constitutes a human soul, and they managed to replicate that artificially. It's like if you took an AI and made it almost human and then put it into an almost human body. Except these Atome are stronger than humans. They're more capable of extraordinary feats than humans are. They are separate from humans. That's the whole conflict within this book. Not only are they separate, not only do they see themselves separate, but they treat humans worse. And due to that discrepancy between the treatment of their kinds, with a capital K, it's very easy for humans and the Atame to fall into opposing sides of understanding, belief, tradition, and that is also one of the main important factors in this, not just the romance. I don't want to downplay it, but I don't want to make it seem like that's the only thing that's going on in here. But aside from the romance, the treatment of humans and the way things work in this world is definitely the biggest driving force in this, with the romance coming incredibly close behind, because certain things would not occur. Most of this plot would not happen if not for that romance. Crier's War, for my sensibilities at the very least, could have stood to be a little more intense. It could have been a little more, this is the thing that's happening, these are the realities and the truth of war, this is the way we've come to live, instead of a lot of it was, once you got past Ayla's primary introductory chapters, a lot of it was implications. A lot of it was people, the human characters, knowing that they were considered less than, knowing that they weren't the ruling class anymore, and how they had to live with that. I think it's easier for BIPOC readers to feel the implications, to understand why certain characters act the way they do. Unfortunately, we've seen that it's a lot easier for certain readers to approve of dramatic action in fiction than in real life. To approve of fighting for resistance and freedom, they would approve of that sooner in fiction, and they would bring it to the theaters and talk about it and laud it for generations to come, as long as it's fiction. But the rest of us, those of us who would act the same in those circumstances, can see this for what it is. We can understand the implications more. We can understand, like Ayla, what would drive a person to act a certain way when fighting for their freedom. A lot of it is a balancing act, trying to figure out how much actual violence is necessary for freedom. You know, Ayla's whole thing is trying to kill Crier, and if she had gone through with that, it would not have made a difference in the long run because of certain things that we learn in book 2. Something that occurs in Crier's War is that you will occasionally get these excerpts of letters, and it'll be letters from characters you meet, characters you'll never meet, characters you'll hear about. I do appreciate that. I appreciate a good letter because it is a great way to share exposition. It's a great way to help us as readers understand things because the characters aren't reading this. The characters, more often than not, aren't aware that these letters exist. And if they do become aware of their existence or the contents of the letters, they find it out through experiences. And in one of these unsent letters that Crier writes to Ayla in the second book, it has the most beautiful, pining, flowery language I've ever heard. I'm definitely, if I had to compare myself to the two, between Ayla and Crier, I'm definitely more on Crier's side. I relate to Crier a little too much, to the point where I would go so far to say, I don't know if this was Nina's intention, but I would say that Crier's pretty autistic coded. As an autistic person myself, the way she understands things, the way she speaks even, is pretty reminiscent of the way I understand and process information and the way I speak. And there is a quote that will probably, I would want this on my tombstone should I ever die. There's a quote that will stick with me, and in it she talks about there being, a paradox of falling, something that Ayla talks about in the first book. I'm gonna actually read the entire letter. It is the last part of this letter that really stuck out with me. Aside from this review, I hope this is the thing that convinces you guys to read it. In the beginning, you told me about the law of falling. How did I reply? Did I reply? I remember everything, yet I do not remember that. Surrounded by the familiar, you'd caught me off guard. As with the night before, you on the cliffs, you in the sea spray, you saving me, the first of many times. You touched the tears on my cheek. You touched my face, and even then, in the beginning, I did not pull away. A law for a paradox. I'll trade you. We believe the universe birthed an infinite number of stars. By this logic, you could stand anywhere in this world and look up at the night sky, and your line of sight would inevitably end on a star. By this logic, the night sky shouldn't be dark at all. It should be a blinding wash of starlight. Therein lies the paradox. The problem is the assumption that the universe is static, unmoving, that every star has always occupied the same space in our sky. The paradox doesn't account for the fact that the universe, like all things, was born and has been growing ever since, expanding outward, pushing, pulling, as you told me. Celestial bodies floating in a black sea, carried by a current older than life, drifting farther and farther apart. The nature of the universe is that everything inside it becomes lonelier and lonelier and lonelier. Some nights I can think of nothing else and nothing more terrifying. Some nights I lie awake thinking of this, and it makes me unspeakably sad. Not as often these days, because it's you. It's you, the wash of starlight, the old paradox. If the universe were static, I could stand anywhere in this world, and I swear my line of sight would end on you. I swear I'd find you in the dark. Oh my fucking god, Nina, how did you come up with that? Like, I write poetry, I write books, and I don't think I've ever written a single line more intense, more gut-wrenching, more emphatic, more whatever other adjectives I could try to come up with that won't hold a candle to the actual emotion that this evokes in me. But just that last paragraph, if the universe were static, I could stand anywhere in this world, and I swear my line of sight would end on you. I started crying when I read that. I was like, oh, this is like real pine tree shit. She is pining. She did not think she was capable of this kind of emotion, and here she is pouring it all out in a letter that she will never send, in words that she, in this moment, doesn't think she will ever say. I cannot give a more emphatic review of this than to say how much it evokes something in me. Than to say how relatable the characters are, how earnest their fight for freedom is, how much you want to root for them. At the beginning of this series, I was wondering if it was going to pull me in two separate directions, if there was going to be a case to be made for the, ironically enough, the maid, the Otome, to be treating humans the way that they are. And I was hesitant at the beginning of this duology to make a stand, because you know how it is with these kind of books. They'll draw you in, they'll lure you in, they'll be like, this is the way things are. Isn't it crazy? Shouldn't things not be that way? And yes, of course, things shouldn't be that way, but why are they that way? And something that I appreciate about this book series is that it makes it clear that the way the Otome are treating the humans, the way that the system of oppression is designed, is corrupt. There's two different perspectives in the book. They alternate every chapter between Ayla and Crier. We never get a perspective from someone who is for oppressing humanity. Even Crier, as naive and complicit as she is in the beginning, she is still not for oppression. She does not believe that humans should be oppressed. We never get the perspective of someone who believes that humanity should be oppressed without it being met with horror, without it being made clear that this is bad, that this is not something that we should be perpetrating, that we shouldn't be for this. And I appreciate that. In a world where people tend to not take sides, in a world where people love to play devil's advocate or see the lesser of two evils, Nina, with Crier's War, is saying there is one evil here, and it's one that we should be fighting against.